My husband of 7 years sent me a text right as I was taking a sip of my chamomile tea. He told me his mother banned me from his sister's wedding because my presence would be an absolute embarrassment to their high society image. What he did not realize was that just 48 hours prior, I had secretly purchased the $5.5 million estate where the wedding was scheduled to take place. I replied with a single word, understood. But 1 hour later, I showed them exactly what happens when you insult the woman who secretly funds your entire lifestyle. Before I reveal how I dismantled their fake empire, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach toxic in-laws a lesson they will never forget. I am Nia. I am 34 years old and I am the president of a private venture capital fund. It is a title I keep entirely hidden from my husband and his incredibly pretentious family. To them, I am just the girl from the wrong side of the tracks who somehow managed to trick their precious son into marriage. I was sitting in my velvet armchair in our downtown penthouse. The warm, amber lighting of the room cast a soft glow over the hardwood floors. It was a Tuesday evening, quiet and peaceful. I had just finished reviewing a quarterly report for one of my subsidiary companies and decided to pour myself a cup of hot tea. I was relaxing, finally taking a moment to breathe after a grueling week of corporate acquisitions. That is when my phone buzzed on the glass coffee table. The screen lit up with a long message from Marcus. Marcus is 36 years old, a bank executive who spends more time obsessing over his golf handicap and country club status than he does looking at his actual bank account. We have been married for 7 years, and for the last few of those years, our marriage has felt more like a business transaction, where I am the only one contributing any actual capital. I picked up the phone expecting a question about dinner or maybe a reminder to pick up his dry cleaning. Instead, I saw a block of text that made my blood run ice cold. Nia, we need to talk about Chloe's wedding this weekend. I am just going to be blunt because there is no easy way to say this. My mother does not want you to attend. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the glass. I took a slow breath and kept reading. You have to understand the situation. Chloe is marrying Bryce, and Bryce comes from a very traditional, very wealthy family from Boston. They are real old money. My mother is already stressed enough trying to make a good impression on them. She feels that your way of speaking and your whole style just do not fit with the aesthetic she is trying to present. Your natural hair, your bright clothes, your background. It is just too much of a contrast. She thinks you will stand out for all the wrong reasons. Honestly, Nia, you are an embarrassment to my family's image. Please just stay home and tell people you are sick. It is better for everyone. An embarrassment to my family's image. Those words echoed in the quiet penthouse. I read the message a second time, then a third. A normal wife might have thrown the phone across the room. A normal wife might have burst into tears, called her best friend, or immediately dialed her husband's number to scream at him until her voice went hoarse. But I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not even let my hands shake. Instead, I sat back against the plush velvet of my chair and took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The sheer audacity of his message was almost comical. Marcus and his mother, Vivian, were obsessed with an illusion. They paraded around Atlanta, acting like they were Southern royalty, turning their noses up at anyone who did not have the right pedigree or the right zip code. They constantly made me feel small, because I grew up in a working-class neighborhood. They loved to pretend they were self-sufficient elites. But the reality was something entirely different. They were drowning in debt. They were desperate for validation from white upper-class families like Bryce's family. They were so busy performing for strangers that they could not see the truth right in front of them. The truth was that I was the one keeping them afloat. I was the one secretly paying the property taxes they mysteriously could not cover. I was the one quietly bailing Marcus out when his bad investments threatened to expose him at the bank. I was the invisible safety net they relied on, yet they had the nerve to call me an embarrassment. I looked at the text message again. He was asking me to hide. He was asking me to erase my identity, to shrink myself down, so his mother could pretend she belonged to a world she could not even afford the entrance fee for. They wanted a perfect, elegant wedding, where they could rub elbows with billionaires, and they thought my presence would shatter that fragile glass house they had built. I placed my teacup gently on the saucer. The porcelain made a soft, decisive clink in the silent room. I unlocked my phone. I did not type out a paragraph explaining my hurt. I did not beg for my husband to defend me against his mother's cruelty. I did not remind him of my worth. I simply tapped out one single word. Understood. I hit send. I watched the little speech bubble appear on the screen, followed almost immediately by the read receipt. I knew exactly what Marcus would be feeling in that moment. Relief. He would think he had gotten his way. He would think I had finally accepted my place at the bottom of his family's hierarchy. He would think I was going to quietly stay in the penthouse nursing my wounded pride while they drank champagne and took family portraits without me. He was so incredibly wrong. By typing that one word, I was not agreeing to stay home. I was acknowledging that the rules of engagement had changed. The marriage was over. The charity was over. The quiet, supportive wife they had so casually discarded was gone. I set the phone face down on the table. The warm light of the room felt different now. It felt like the calm before a devastating storm. They wanted to play a game of wealth, status, and power. They wanted to show off for the Boston elite and pretend they were untouchable. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed the match to the person holding the gasoline. The Washington family name carried a heavy manufactured weight in Atlanta. For decades, Vivian Washington played the role of the ultimate matriarch of the Black elite. She hosted exclusive charity galas, demanded VIP treatment at her country club, and never let anyone forget that her late husband came from a long line of prominent physicians and scholars. To hear her tell it, the Washingtons were practically royalty. She wore vintage pearls to the grocery store and spoke with a practiced, clipped diction designed to intimidate anyone she deemed beneath her social station. Marcus and his sister Chloe were raised to believe they were inherently superior to the rest of the world simply because of their last name. They operated on the assumption that their bloodline granted them a free pass to the front of every line in life. Then there was me. I grew up in East Point. My mother was a hardworking postal worker, and my father managed a local hardware store. I did not attend a prestigious private academy, and I certainly did not have a lavish debutante ball to announce my arrival into high society. I earned academic scholarships, worked late shifts at a diner to pay for my textbooks, and built my wealth from the ground up through sheer willpower. I learned how to analyze market trends, secure venture capital, and multiply assets while Vivian was busy learning how to properly fold linen napkins for high tea. I understood the value of $1 because I had to fight for every single one of them. Vivienne never missed an opportunity to remind me of the vast difference in our pedigrees. At every family Thanksgiving dinner, she would find a way to weaponize my working-class roots. She would look at my natural hair and offer me the business card of her high-end stylist, suggesting I needed a more refined and manageable look. When I wore a custom-tailored suit that I bought with my own hard-earned money, she would ask if I found it on the clearance rack at a discount department store. She treated me like a charity project her son had dragged home. To her, I was just a gritty street girl who should be eternally grateful simply to sit at their mahogany dining table. She loved to whisper to her wealthy friends that Marcus had a remarkably big heart for being willing to marry so far down the social ladder. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The Grand Washington legacy Vivian guarded so fiercely was nothing but smoke and mirrors. By the time I married Marcus, their family fortune was already completely gone. His father had made a series of disastrous investments in the late 90s, and Vivian absolutely refused to adjust her lavish lifestyle to match their new grim reality. She kept throwing extravagant parties, flying first class to Europe, and funding Marcus and Chloe through expensive degree programs they barely managed to finish. When the creditors started calling, they scrambled desperately to keep up appearances, terrified that Atlanta high society would find out they were broke. That was exactly where I came in. For the past 7 years, I had been the invisible pillar holding up their crumbling empire. When Marcus faced total professional and financial ruin because a real estate venture went sideways, I quietly funneled money through a shell company to bail him out. When Vivian's prestigious country club membership was about to be publicly revoked for unpaid dues, I hacked into Marcus's personal accounts and paid the massive balance under the guise of a sudden work bonus he supposedly received. I paid the skyrocketing property taxes on their ancestral home to keep it from going to public auction. I did it all from the shadows because I loved my husband. I foolishly believed that protecting his pride was what a good wife was supposed to do. I stayed in the background, letting Marcus play the role of the successful breadwinner while I ran a massive venture capital fund that they knew absolutely nothing about. I thought my silent financial support would eventually earn their genuine respect. Instead, it only fueled their massive delusion. They took the money I secretly provided and used it to fund the very lifestyle they utilized to exclude me. They took my exhausting hard work and repackaged it to the world as their own generational wealth. Vivian actually believed her family was thriving because of their superior intellect and impeccable breeding. She had absolutely no idea that the woman she called a ghetto embarrassment, the girl from East Point with the natural hair and the wrong background, was the sole reason she was not standing in a soup kitchen line. And now this wedding. Chloe marrying Bryce Sterling was Vivian's ultimate triumph. The Sterlings were old money from Boston. They were white, ultra-conservative, and possessed a bank account that Vivian desperately wanted to align with to save her sinking ship. For the past year, Vivian and Chloe had been bending over backward to impress the Sterlings. They changed the way they spoke. They hid away anything that made them look too cultural or too loud. They wanted to present a sterile, perfectly curated version of Black excellence to win the approval of a family that probably barely tolerated them in the first place. In Vivian's eyes, I was a massive liability to this carefully choreographed performance. She was terrified that I might use the wrong fork at the rehearsal dinner, or laugh too loudly, or mention something about my humble beginnings that would shatter her carefully constructed facade. She looked at me and saw everything she was trying to run away from. She could not see the power I held because she was entirely blinded by her own prejudice. She wanted to erase me from the family picture to secure her position with the Sterlings. She was about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you bite the only hand that feeds you. I leaned further back into the plush velvet of my chair, a slow smile stretching across my face as I thought about the sheer delightful irony of his text message. Just 48 hours ago, the carefully constructed Washington facade had completely shattered behind closed doors. The scene had been pathetic. Vivian had been sitting right here in my living room sobbing hysterically into a silk handkerchief. The bank had finally run out of patience. Their so-called ancestral estate, the one she constantly bragged about at her exclusive country club, was officially slapped with a final foreclosure notice. The timing could not have been worse for her. With the Sterlings flying down from Boston for the wedding in a matter of days, Vivian was facing the ultimate social execution. She was going to have to explain to her billionaire future-in-laws why she was being thrown out onto the street. Marcus had come to me sweating through his custom-tailored suit, practically begging for a massive cash injection. He needed a temporary fix, a luxury rental property just long enough to host the wedding and maintain their wealthy illusion. He demanded the money with that same arrogant entitlement he always used, acting as though my hard-earned wealth was his birthright. I did not give him the cash. Instead, I made a much more permanent calculating move. I utilized one of my anonymous holding companies, a blind trust that is heavily protected and completely untraceable to my name. Through that legal entity, I purchased a breathtaking $5.5 million mega mansion in the heart of Buckhead. It is a sprawling ivy-covered estate with a sweeping circular driveway, imported Italian marble floors, and perfectly manicured lawns that stretch for acres. It is exactly the kind of pristine old money aesthetic Vivian worshipped. I had my corporate lawyers structure the paperwork brilliantly. We made it look like a highly exclusive private wealth management firm was extending Marcus a specialized high-risk mortgage based purely on his future earning potential. Marcus, blinded by his own towering ego, did not ask a single question. He actually believed his smooth talking and his mediocre banking credentials had secured this miraculous deal. He strutted around the penthouse, puffing out his chest, telling his mother that he had single-handedly saved the family legacy. I watched Vivian weep tears of joy, praising her golden boy for providing a magnificent home worthy of hosting the Sterling family. Neither of them bothered to read the fine print. If Marcus had paid even a fraction of attention to the legal documents he hastily signed, he would have realized he did not own a single brick of that property. He is not on the deed. He does not hold the mortgage. My LLC purchased the house in cold hard cash. I am the sole absolute undisputed legal owner of that $5.5 million estate. Marcus and Vivian were simply granted a highly conditional occupancy agreement, essentially making them glorified guests living on my property. And now, sitting in my penthouse staring at the message telling me I was forbidden from attending the wedding, the absolute comedy of the situation washed over me. Marcus was banning me from a high society event that was literally taking place on my front lawn. He was telling me I was too unrefined, too street, and too embarrassing to set foot in a $5.5 million mansion that I had bought and paid for exactly 2 days ago. They thought I was sitting at home nursing a broken heart. They genuinely believed I was humiliated, crying over their cruel rejection. They had no idea that I held the deed to their entire fake reality. Every crystal chandelier Vivian was currently polishing every imported tile she was walking on to impress her rich white in-laws belonged entirely to me. By sending that text, Marcus did not just insult his wife. He violated the unspoken contract of our entire relationship. For years, I had quietly funded their vanity. I had given them the ultimate stage to perform their grand illusion of black excellence, and they chose to use that very stage to lock me out. They wanted to erase me to make the Boston elite feel more comfortable. They wanted to pretend my money was their money. I took another sip of my tea, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace settle over my spirit. There would be no arguments tonight. There would be no pleading for my husband to recognize my worth. I had spent 7 years trying to prove I belonged in a family that was completely beneath my actual standard. They wanted a flawless, high-class wedding and a multi-million-dollar estate. I was going to let them set up every chair, arrange every floral centerpiece, and invite every single important guest. I was going to let them climb all the way to the very top of their imaginary social ladder right before I pulled the ladder out from under them. Bryce Sterling was the catalyst for this entire miserable circus. He was not just rich, he was Mayflower rich. His family had trust funds older than the state of Georgia, and the Sterling name was carved into the stone facades of libraries at Ivy League universities across Massachusetts. Bryce himself was perfectly pleasant, a tall, perpetually sunburned man who wore boat shoes without socks and spoke extensively about his family's summer compound in Nantucket. He lived in a bubble of complete and utter privilege, entirely oblivious to the frantic tap dance my mother-in-law was performing just to keep his attention. To Vivian, Bryce was not just a future son-in-law, he was a life raft. Marrying Chloe off to a Sterling was the ultimate validation, the final stamp of approval that would permanently elevate the Washington name into the untouchable stratosphere of the American elite. But securing that ring required a level of assimilation that bordered on psychological warfare. The metamorphosis began the very second Chloe flashed that massive emerald-cut diamond. Overnight, the Washington household was subjected to a brutal, systematic cultural bleaching. Vivian and Chloe completely reinvented themselves. They abandoned their vibrant, expressive wardrobes and suddenly dressed exclusively in muted earth tones, pastel twin sets, and stiff linen. They looked like they were constantly auditioning for a country club catalog. But the physical changes were nothing compared to the psychological ones. Vivian actually hired a private elocution coach. She claimed it was to ensure Chloe's wedding vows sounded perfectly polished, but I knew exactly what was happening. They were systematically scrubbing every ounce of Atlanta out of their voices. They practiced softening their consonants and stretching their vowels, adopting a hollow, breathy cadence that they thought sounded like old money Boston. It was excruciating to watch. They were suffocating their own identities just to make a group of wealthy white strangers feel more comfortable. Even their history was sanitized. One afternoon, I stopped by their old house before the foreclosure hit and caught Vivian frantically stripping the hallway walls. She was taking down framed photographs of Marcus and Chloe's extended family. Pictures of uncles with locks, cousins, in vibrant traditional prints, and joyous, loud family barbecues were unceremoniously dumped into cardboard boxes and shoved into the attic. In their place, she hung sterile, generic landscape paintings in framed degrees. She was literally erasing her own bloodline because she was terrified the Sterlings might realize the Washingtons were entirely too black for their liking. They overhauled the wedding menu, tossing out the rich, heavily seasoned family recipes that had been passed down for generations. Instead, they demanded the caterers serve unseasoned poached salmon, miniature beef Wellingtons, and bland endive salads. Vivian was terrified that anything too flavorful might offend the delicate palates of her future in-laws. She was willing to starve her own culture just to secure a seat at their table. Marcus was no better. Watching my husband morph into a subservient echo of Bryce Sterling was one of the most pathetic things I have ever witnessed. Marcus abandoned his own friends, the men he had known since college, because they did not fit the aesthetic Bryce was accustomed to. Instead, Marcus started spending his weekends pretending he understood the nuances of sailing and nodding enthusiastically whenever Bryce lectured him about vintage wine allocations. Marcus actually bought a pair of Argyle sweaters and started using the word summer as a verb. He was selling his soul for proximity to whiteness and wealth, completely abandoning the man I had married. Chloe, meanwhile, treated Bryce like he was a deity who had descended from the heavens to rescue her. She agreed with his every opinion, laughed at his dry, humorless jokes, and allowed Eleanor Sterling, Bryce's mother, to completely dictate the wedding plans. Eleanor chose the floral arrangements, Eleanor approved the guest list, and Eleanor even selected Chloe's wedding dress, an aggressively conservative high-necked lace gown that completely washed out Chloe's complexion. Chloe swallowed her pride and smiled through it all, terrified that showing even a hint of independence might cause the Sterlings to withdraw their invitation into high society. And then there was me. I was the one element Vivian could not control, could not bleach, and could not stuff into a cardboard box in the attic. I refused to play their pathetic game of assimilation. I am a proud, self-made black woman who built a financial empire from nothing. I wear my natural hair in thick, beautiful braids. I speak with the rhythm, warmth, and volume of the community that raised me. I do not shrink myself, I do not lower my voice, and I certainly do not alter my vocabulary to appease the fragile sensibilities of the white elite. My unapologetic authenticity terrified Vivian to her core. During the few agonizing dinners we were forced to share with Bryce's parents, I could physically see the panic radiating from my mother-in-law. Eleanor Sterling was a rigid, judgmental woman who looked at everything through a microscope of classism. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, Vivian's eyes would widen in sheer terror. If I mentioned anything about my childhood in East Point, or my mother's shifts at the post office, Vivian would practically shout over me forcefully, steering the conversation toward tedious topics like yacht maintenance or equestrian events. She treated me like a loaded grenade sitting in the middle of her pristine dining table. She did not just view me as a social liability, she knew that I was a mirror. My presence was a glaring, undeniable reminder of the truth they were so desperately trying to hide. If Eleanor Sterling spent more than 10 minutes engaging in a real conversation with me, the entire Washington illusion would shatter. Eleanor would immediately spot the massive canyon between my genuine, grounded confidence and Vivian's desperate, suffocating performance. She would see that I possessed actual power, while Vivian was merely playing a part. As the wedding day loomed closer, the pressure on Vivian reached a breaking point. The Sterlings were chartering private jets to bring dozens of their aristocratic relatives down to Atlanta. The sheer magnitude of the lie Vivian was maintaining was cracking her fragile psyche. She was terrified that one wrong word, one wrong laugh, or one inappropriate guest would cause the Sterlings to realize they were marrying into a family of broke, desperate pretenders. That was the exact reason she forced Marcus to send that text message banning me from the ceremony. It had nothing to do with me being an embarrassment. It had everything to do with her blinding fear. She needed me erased from the narrative because my reality threatened her fantasy. She needed a completely sanitized, perfectly obedient cast of characters to pull off the ultimate social heist. She thought locking me out of the wedding was the final piece of the puzzle. She thought she had successfully eliminated the only threat to her grand illusion. But as I sat in my penthouse looking out over the glittering Atlanta skyline, I knew she had just made the most catastrophic miscalculation of her entire life. By trying to lock me out of the picture, she had blindly handed me the keys to the entire gallery. The sheer audacity of her grand illusion did not materialize overnight. The foundation for my ultimate revenge was laid exactly 3 weeks prior, during a moment of disrespect so profound it almost defied logic. The Sterlings had flown down from Massachusetts for an impromptu weekend visit to inspect the wedding venue. Marcus had practically begged me to stay hidden away at the penthouse, claiming the meeting was just a tedious logistical walkthrough for the wedding planners. But I am not a fool, and I am certainly not an absentee landlord. I needed to stop by the Buckhead property to sign off on a crucial landscaping permit required by the city, a permit that only the legal owner of the estate could authorize. I arrived at the property and let myself in through the heavy custom-carved mahogany front doors. The moment I stepped into the grand foyer, I heard Vivian's voice echoing off the imported Italian marble floors. She was speaking in that unbearable, breathy cadence she reserved exclusively for wealthy white people. I walked quietly down the hallway, the thick Persian rugs muffling my footsteps, until I reached the entrance of the sprawling formal living room. There, standing under a massive crystal chandelier, was Vivian. She was walking arm in arm with Bryce's mother, Eleanor Sterling. Bryce, Chloe, and my husband Marcus trailed a few steps behind them like obedient lapdogs. I stood in the shadows just outside the doorframe, perfectly positioned to hear every single word without being seen. Vivian gestured grandly toward the soaring ceiling and the intricate crown molding. "This estate has been the crown jewel of the Washington family for generations," Vivian proclaimed, not a single stutter in her voice. "Marcus's great-grandfather acquired the original acreage back in the early 20th century. It has been a monumental task, but we have meticulously preserved the architectural integrity to ensure our family legacy remains untouched for the next generation." I stopped breathing. For a full 10 seconds, I simply stood there, entirely paralyzed by the astronomical scale of her lie. Marcus's great-grandfather was a hard-working sharecropper who never owned a single square foot of Atlanta real estate. He certainly did not pass down a $5.5 million mega mansion in Buckhead. I knew this because I had wired the funds from my offshore holding company to purchase this exact house exactly 14 days prior to this tour. I had personally selected that crystal chandelier from a high-end catalog in Milan. Every brick, every marble tile, every blade of grass she was currently pointing to was paid for by the blood, sweat, and capital of the girl from East Point she loved to call a ghetto embarrassment. She was not just putting on a show for the Sterlings. She was actively hijacking my financial triumph, erasing my labor, and repackaging my success as a mythical patriarchal inheritance to impress a billionaire from Boston. Eleanor Sterling looked around the room, her cold, judgmental eyes scanning the immaculate decor. She nodded with a tight, approving smile. "It is quite magnificent, Vivian. It is so rare to find families who truly understand the burden and the privilege of preserving generational wealth. Bryce is very fortunate to be marrying into such an established lineage." At that exact moment, Marcus shifted his weight and caught sight of me standing in the hallway. The color instantly drained from my husband's face. He went completely rigid, his eyes widening in absolute unfiltered panic. He knew I was the sole owner of the LLC holding the deed. He knew I carried the actual property documents in the leather briefcase currently resting in my hand. He knew that with one single sentence, I could shatter this entire charade into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. I could walk into that room, introduce myself as the landlord, and watch Vivian die of social humiliation right there on her beloved Italian marble. Marcus stared at me, his chest heaving under his designer suit. He gave me a look of pure, pathetic desperation. He was silently begging me to protect his mother's lie. He was choosing his family's fake prestige over his wife's reality, silently demanding that I swallow my pride so they could continue to feast on my resources. Vivian turned around to follow Marcus's gaze. When she saw me standing there, a flash of sheer terror crossed her features. But Vivian was a master manipulator. Within a fraction of a second, she recovered her composure, her face morphing into a mask of polite condescension. "Oh, Nia," Vivienne said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness as she addressed me like I was a lost delivery driver. "Eleanor, this is Marcus's wife. She handles administrative tasks for a small local business. She must be here to drop off some paperwork for Marcus." Eleanor Sterling turned to look at me. She looked me up and down, taking in my natural braids and my tailored yet understated business suit. Her eyes held that specific brand of polite disdain reserved for people she deemed entirely irrelevant. "How lovely to meet you," Eleanor said, her tone utterly dismissive. "You must feel so incredibly fortunate to have married into such a prominent, established family. This magnificent ancestral home is quite a lot to take in, isn't it?" I looked at Eleanor. I looked at Vivienne, who was holding her breath, her manicured hands trembling slightly at her sides. And then I looked at my husband. Marcus was practically sweating, his jaw clenched tight, waiting for the bomb to go off. I had a choice to make. I could drop the bomb right then and there. I could pull the landscaping permit from my briefcase, show Eleanor Sterling the signature line requiring the actual property owner's authorization, and watch the Washington legacy burn to the ground. But as I looked at their terrified faces, a cold, calculating clarity washed over me. Exposing them in front of just Bryce and his parents would be a minor scandal. They would find a way to spin it. Vivienne would invent some lie about a temporary trust fund transfer, and Marcus would gaslight me for ruining a private family moment. A quiet execution was not enough for a crime of this magnitude. If they wanted to steal my empire and claim it as their own, they needed to fall from the absolute highest peak possible. I wanted them to print the gold foil invitations. I wanted them to hire the 200-person catering staff. I wanted every prominent socialite politician and business mogul in Atlanta to be standing on my front lawn when the truth came out. I wanted their humiliation to be loud, public, and brutally permanent. So I made my choice. I did not scream. I did not pull out the deed. I looked directly into my mother-in-law's terrified eyes, and I smiled. It was a warm, wide, terrifyingly calm smile. "It is a breathtaking property, Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly measured. "It truly is a testament to what a person can build from nothing but sheer willpower and hard work. I am constantly amazed by who actually holds the keys to this kind of power." Vivienne swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. Marcus let out a shaky exhale, foolishly believing he had survived the crisis. I politely excused myself, walked into the home office, signed my landscaping permit, and left them to their delusions. As I walked back to my car, my mind was already racing miles ahead. That was the day the quiet, supportive wife officially died. That was the day I stopped being Marcus's partner and became the architect of his total destruction. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of generational wealth. I was going to let them roll the dice, knowing I owned the entire casino. The days leading up to the main event became an agonizing marathon of forced smiles and blatant disrespect. But the true breaking point, the moment that completely extinguished any lingering trace of mercy in my heart, occurred during the official pre-wedding family portrait session. Vivienne had hired a highly sought-after celebrity photographer to capture the Washington family in all their manufactured aristocratic glory. The setting was the grand sweeping staircase of the mansion, bathed in the soft golden light of the late afternoon. I had dressed impeccably for the occasion. I wore a custom emerald green silk dress that complemented my skin perfectly, and my hair was styled in intricate, elegant locks, pulled up into a regal crown. I looked beautiful. I looked like a woman who owned the very ground she was standing on. But to Vivienne, I looked like a liability. I was standing near the edge of the grand foyer, waiting for the photographer to finish adjusting his lighting umbrellas. The Sterling family had not yet arrived for the joint portraits, leaving just the Washingtons to capture their immediate family shots. I watched as Vivienne directed Chloe and Marcus, positioning them like mannequins on the marble steps. When the photographer politely motioned for me to join my husband on the second step, the entire room suddenly went ice cold. Vivienne held up a rigid hand, halting the photographer in his tracks. She marched over to him, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floor, and whispered something in his ear. The photographer looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting his gaze between Vivian and me. Then Vivian turned on her heel and walked directly up to me. She did not bother to lower her voice. She wanted the entire room, the assistants, the catering staff setting up in the adjacent hall, and most importantly, her son to hear every single word. "I need you to step out of the frame entirely," Vivian commanded, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "In fact, I have instructed the photographer to ensure you are not included in any of the primary family portfolios." I stood perfectly still, my heart hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs. I could feel a sudden, violent tremor of rage vibrating through my hands. It was a visceral, overwhelming urge to shatter the pristine illusion right then and there. But I forced my breathing to slow, locking my muscles down, burying the fury deep within my chest, until my composure returned to an absolute chilling calm. "Why exactly is that Vivian?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously smooth. She looked me up and down with a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Look at yourself, Naya. Your natural hair, that overly bright dress you are wearing, your entire demeanor. It is entirely too ghetto. It screams working class. We are about to merge with the Sterling family. They are American royalty. We need absolute flawless elegance to step into their world, and you are a glaring reminder of everything we are trying to leave behind. I will not have you ruining our legacy in these photographs." Too ghetto. The woman who was currently breathing the air conditioning I paid for, standing in the foyer of a $5.5 million estate I legally owned, was calling me ghetto. She was attempting to erase me from the visual history of a family that only survived because I allowed it. I slowly turned my head to look at my husband. This was his moment. This was the exact moment a real man, a real partner, would have stepped off those marble stairs, taken his wife by the hand, and walked out the front door. I waited for Marcus to defend me. I waited for him to tell his mother that she had crossed an unforgivable line. Instead, Marcus cowardly looked down at his phone. He unlocked the screen and began scrolling frantically, pretending he was completely absorbed in some sudden, urgent work email. He stood there in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, avoiding my gaze entirely, letting his mother publicly degrade his wife. His silence was deafening. It was the ultimate betrayal. He was not just failing to protect me, he was actively participating in my erasure. A pathetic, spineless coward. That was the man I had spent 7 years loving and protecting. Vivian crossed her arms, mistaking my silence for submission. "You can stay in the back rooms until the Sterlings arrive," she added, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. "We will call you if we need you for a wide group shot, though I highly doubt that will be necessary." I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked at Marcus one last time, cementing his cowardice into my memory, and then I looked back at Vivian. Her arrogant, triumphant smile was practically glowing. She genuinely thought she had won. She thought she had successfully cut the dead weight from her pristine family portrait. I nodded slowly, my face a mask of absolute serenity. "Of course, Vivian," I replied smoothly. "It is your day to shine. I would not dream of ruining your perfect picture." I turned and walked away, my heels echoing steadily across the Italian marble. I did not go to the back rooms to hide. I walked straight into the private executive study, the only room in the house I had specifically instructed the wedding planners to leave untouched. I closed the heavy oak doors behind me and locked them. The time for playing the supportive wife was officially over. If they wanted to erase me from their family, I was more than happy to oblige them. But I was not going to quietly fade into the background. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire universe, and I was going to make sure they remembered my name for the rest of their miserable lives. I sat back in the heavy leather chair of the executive study, the thick oak doors firmly muffling the frantic wedding preparations echoing through the rest of the house. I picked up a delicate porcelain cup from the mahogany desk and took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. If there were a camera capturing this exact moment, it would be pulling back right now, widening the frame to reveal not just a woman sitting alone in a quiet room, but a grandmaster silently surveying a perfectly set chessboard. Vivian thought she had merely secured a spectacular temporary backdrop to impress her future in-laws. She genuinely believed this $5.5 million mega mansion was just a luxurious place to sleep, host a few preliminary dinners, and take her manufactured family portraits. She completely failed to comprehend the true magnitude of the trap she had blindly walked into. This estate was not just their temporary housing, it was the actual designated venue for the wedding ceremony and the reception. Eleanor Sterling determined to host a high society event that her Boston friends would talk about for decades, had refused to book a standard hotel ballroom or a country club. She wanted a private, exclusive Gatsby-level garden party. When Marcus had miraculously produced this Buckhead estate, Eleanor had immediately deemed the sprawling manicured grounds the perfect canvas for her vision. And because the Sterlings possessed bottomless wealth and a desperate need to show it off, they had opened their checkbooks without a single second of hesitation. Over the past 48 hours, I had watched from a distance as Bryce's family poured more than $200,000 into transforming the backyard into a literal wonderland. Through the massive bay window of the study, I had a perfect unobstructed view of their investment. A massive climate-controlled glass pavilion had been erected squarely on the south lawn, featuring draped silk ceilings and imported crystal chandeliers that rivaled the ones inside the house. An army of frantic florists was currently arranging thousands of imported white orchids, hydrangeas, and rare roses into towering floral arches along the makeshift aisle. A custom-built stage, complete with professional lighting rigs and a monogrammed dance floor bearing the Sterling and Washington initials in gold leaf, sat perfectly leveled over the pristine grass. The Sterlings had spared absolutely no expense to ensure their son's wedding was a masterpiece of old-money extravagance. Michelin-starred caterers were presently setting up mobile industrial kitchens in the expansive driveway. A string quartet was practicing near the marble garden fountains. Truckloads of vintage champagne and top-tier catering equipment were being unloaded by dozens of workers rushing back and forth across the property. Everything was flawless. Everything was paid for by the Sterling Family Trust. But there was one microscopic, catastrophic detail neither the Sterlings nor the Washingtons had bothered to verify. They had built this entire multi-$100,000 fantasy on dirt that legally belonged exclusively to me. Every single white orchid, every pane of glass in that massive pavilion, every crystal goblet resting on those banquet tables was currently sitting on private residential property deeded solely to my anonymous holding company. Vivian was strutting around out there on the patio, barking orders at the catering staff, acting like the undisputed lady of the manor, completely oblivious to the fact that she was effectively trespassing. Eleanor Sterling was directing the floral arrangements with a smug look of aristocratic authority, entirely unaware that she was illegally modifying land without the actual property owner's consent. The sheer delicious irony of the situation was almost intoxicating. Marcus had banned me from the wedding because I was supposedly a liability to their high-class image. He told me to stay hidden in my penthouse so I would not embarrass his mother in front of her wealthy guests. He had no idea that I held the ultimate veto power over every single thing happening outside that window. I took another sip of my tea, savoring the quiet warmth of the room. The trap was not just set. It was fully baited, loaded, and locked. The Washingtons and the Sterlings had invested their money, their time, and their entire social reputation into this specific location. They had invited the absolute elite of Atlanta and Boston to arrive at this exact address by tomorrow morning. They had tied their entire social survival to a piece of real estate that I could shut down with a single phone call. I watched Chloe point at the floral arches, her face glowing with the smug satisfaction of a woman who thought she had finally secured her elevated status. I watched Marcus carrying a clipboard, laughing with Bryce as they inspected the outdoor bar, playing the role of the successful, generous host. They were so incredibly close to the finish line. They could practically taste the elite status they had craved for years. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded the working-class girl from East Point and secured their spot among the billionaires. But as I sat in the executive study of my own $5.5 million home, holding the deed that controlled their destiny, I knew the game was only just beginning. I was going to let them finish placing every single orchid. I was going to let them chill the champagne and lay out the red carpet. I was going to let them build their beautiful, expensive glass house right up until the very last second. Friday evening draped itself over Atlanta in a thick blanket of humid air and golden ambient light. If you were standing at the bottom of the grand driveway looking up toward the estate, the sight would command absolute silence. A slow sweeping glance from right to left would reveal a scene lifted directly from a cinematic masterpiece. The glass pavilion we had watched them build now glowed like a magnificent, oversized jewel box resting on the manicured south lawn. Inside that transparent structure, the rehearsal dinner was in full swing. I had not returned to the Buckhead estate to cause a scene. I had no intention of crashing their intimate, highly curated evening. The world of high finance simply does not pause for a rehearsal dinner, and I had left a highly sensitive merger and acquisition file secured inside the wall safe of the executive study. It was a document detailing a 9-figure tech buyout, a piece of paper worth substantially more than the combined net worth of every single guest currently sipping champagne on my lawn. I needed it for an early Saturday morning conference call with my Tokyo partners. I parked my car discreetly down the street, intentionally avoiding the frantic valet station set up near the front gates. As I walked up the winding, tree-lined driveway, the sounds of their manufactured aristocratic reality drifted through the warm night air. A live jazz quartet was playing a smooth instrumental rendition of a classic standard. The clinking of imported crystal glassware and the low synchronized hum of wealthy, polite laughter floated toward me. Through the glowing glass walls of the pavilion, I could see the players performing their designated roles perfectly. The Sterling family sat at the head table draped in their understated monochromatic luxury. Bryce was standing holding a microphone giving a toast that had Eleanor and the rest of the Boston contingent nodding with polite approval. Chloe gazed up at him with an expression of pure, practiced adoration. And then there was Vivienne. She was floating from table to table wearing a shimmering silver gown that she had undoubtedly charged to one of Marcus's quickly maxing out credit cards. She was holding court laughing with her head thrown back, touching the arms of the Sterling patriarchs, playing the ultimate role of the Southern matriarch who had finally merged her prestigious bloodline with Northern royalty. She looked completely in her element, entirely convinced that she had successfully orchestrated the social coup of the century. I bypassed the illuminated pathway leading to the pavilion and stepped onto the wide marble stairs of the main house. A hired private security guard in a dark suit stepped into my path, raising a hand to block the heavy mahogany double doors. He politely informed me that the residence was closed for a private event. I did not argue with him. I simply reached forward, flipped open the brass cover of the biometric security panel, and pressed my thumb against the scanner. The heavy internal deadbolts clicked open, instantly echoing with a solid metallic thud. The security guard stepped back, his eyes widening in confusion as I pushed the doors open and walked into the grand foyer. The interior of the house was a chaotic contrast to the serene elegance of the pavilion outside. It had been completely overrun by the event staff. Dozens of caterers in crisp black uniforms were rushing back and forth down the hallways, carrying massive silver trays of hors d'oeuvres and polished ice buckets. Event coordinators with headsets were whispering frantically into their microphones, directing the flow of the evening. They were treating my $5.5 million property like it was a rented banquet hall. I moved silently through the chaos, avoiding the main sightlines of the French doors that opened out to the lawn. I was a ghost haunting my own house. I reached the executive study, closed the heavy door behind me, and locked it. The room was dark, save for the ambient light spilling in from the pavilion outside. I walked over to the oil painting hanging on the far wall, swung it open, and quickly entered the passcode for the hidden safe. I retrieved the thick manila folder containing my merger documents and slipped it into my leather tote bag. My business was officially concluded. I could have turned around, walked out the front door, and driven back to my penthouse. I could have let them finish their rehearsal dinner in peace, knowing the ultimate trap was already set for tomorrow morning. But as I turned to leave the study, the heavy oak door suddenly swung open. I froze. The light from the hallway spilled into the dark room, illuminating the figure standing in the doorway. It was Vivienne. She had stepped inside the house, likely seeking a moment away from the crowd to powder her nose or relish her own reflection in the hallway mirrors. She froze the second she saw me standing near the desk. The silver sequined gown she wore caught the light, but the absolute horror draining the color from her face was the only thing I noticed. For a fraction of a second, the wealthy aristocratic hostess vanished. The mask slipped completely, revealing a desperate, terrified woman staring at the very person she had tried so hard to erase. She quickly glanced over her shoulder, checking the hallway to ensure none of the Sterling family members had followed her inside. When she realized the coast was clear, her fear instantly morphed into a frantic, venomous rage. She stepped into the study and slammed the door shut behind her, cutting us off from the catering staff in the hallway. Her chest was heaving. The pristine, elegant facade she had maintained all evening shattered as she glared at me, her voice dropping to a harsh, panicked whisper. The tension in the room thickened, suffocating and sharp. The jazz music from the pavilion outside seemed to mock the absolute silence stretching between us in the dark study. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my hand resting casually on the strap of my tote bag. I was standing in a house I paid for, holding documents worth millions, staring down a woman whose entire existence currently depended on my mercy. And she was about to make the biggest mistake of her evening. "What on earth are you doing in here?" Vivian hissed. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence of the room like a jagged piece of glass. She closed the distance between us in 3 frantic strides. Before I could even raise my hand to defend my personal space, her manicured fingers clamped down hard on my forearm. Her grip was entirely unhinged, her acrylic nails digging sharply into the fabric of my tailored blazer. She yanked me forcefully away from the ambient light spilling through the windows, dragging me deeper into the darkest corner of the executive study. I did not stumble. I simply let her pull me into the shadows, planting my feet firmly onto the Persian rug. The air between us was suddenly suffocating, thick with the overwhelming scent of her expensive Chanel perfume and the sour, undeniable stench of her absolute panic. Her chest heaved violently under her silver-sequined gown. She looked completely deranged, a woman watching her entire fabricated universe teeter on the absolute edge of a cliff. "Are you out of your mind?" Vivian spat the words directly into my face, her eyes wide and wild. "The Sterling family is right outside that window. Eleanor is sitting less than 50 feet away from this room. If she looks up and sees you standing in here, everything is completely ruined. What the hell is wrong with you? Why are you trying to destroy my daughter's wedding?" I looked down at her hand, still clutching my arm with desperate, trembling force. I did not pull away. I wanted to feel the exact weight of her desperation. I wanted to memorize the precise amount of pressure she was applying to the woman who was quietly funding the very dress she was wearing. I left a highly confidential file in the wall safe. "Vivian," I replied. My voice was perfectly leveled, stripped of any emotion, any fear, or any intimidation. "I came to retrieve my property. I have no interest in your rehearsal dinner, and I have absolutely no interest in Eleanor Sterling. I am leaving now." I made a slight movement to turn toward the heavy oak doors leading to the grand foyer. Vivian's grip tightened instantly. She stepped directly into my path, physically blocking my exit with her own body. The sheer audacity of her movement was staggering. She was a tenant at will, standing in my house, attempting to hold me hostage in my own study. "You are not walking out that door!" she commanded, her voice vibrating with a venomous, frantic authority. "You are not going to stroll through my grand foyer and risk Eleanor seeing you leaving through the front entrance. I will not allow you to parade your natural hair and your street aesthetic in front of my guests. You are going to turn around right now. You are going to walk down the back hallway. You are going to merge with the catering staff. And you are going to leave this property through the service entrance." The service entrance. The words hung in the dark room, heavy and toxic. For a moment, the world outside the study completely vanished. The jazz music, the clinking crystal, the wealthy laughter on the lawn all faded into an absolute terrifying silence. If a camera were focusing on my face right now, it would be pushing in incredibly slowly, capturing the exact microscopic shift in my eyes. The last remaining fragment of my empathy for the Washington family simply ceased to exist. Vivian was not just insulting my appearance. She was demanding that I, a self-made black female millionaire, lower my head, hide my face, and shuffle out the back door of my own $5.5 million mansion like a hired servant. She was demanding that I masquerade as the hired help just to ensure a group of wealthy white aristocrats felt comfortable in a house they did not even own. She was willing to completely strip away my dignity, my humanity, and my rightful place in the world just to protect a pathetic, desperate lie. "Do you understand me?" Vivienne pressed, shaking my arm slightly when I did not immediately respond. "You will blend in with the waitstaff. You will carry your little bag out the back door where the garbage is collected, and you will get off my property before you ruin the most important night of Chloe's life. Do not make me call security to have you forcibly removed from my house." Her house. She actually called it her house. The delusion was so deeply embedded in her psyche that she had entirely severed ties with reality. She genuinely believed her own theatrical performance. She thought she held the power to banish me to the service corridors. I stared directly into Vivian's panicked, arrogant eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic, trembling energy. I stood with the absolute terrifying stillness of an apex predator watching its prey blindly walk into a snare. The cold, calculating machinery of my mind shifted into high gear. I analyzed every single syllable she had just spoken, every insult, every demand, every racist, classist assumption she had projected onto me for the past 7 years, crystallized into a single unbreakable resolve. I was going to destroy her. I was not just going to embarrass her. I was going to systematically dismantle her entire existence. I was going to rip the foundation out from under her feet and watch her plummet into the very poverty she was so desperately trying to outrun. I slowly raised my furry hand and placed my fingers directly over hers. My touch was light, but the icy, commanding authority in my grip made her instantly freeze. I gently but forcefully peeled her manicured fingers off my tailored blazer, dropping her hand back to her side, as if she were a child who had reached for something hot on a stove. Vivian opened her mouth to issue another frantic command, but the words died in her throat. She finally saw the look in my eyes. It was not the look of a submissive, apologetic daughter-in-law. It was not the look of a woman who was intimidated by the Sterling family wealth. It was the look of an executioner. The sudden, suffocating realization that she had gravely miscalculated the power dynamic in this room flickered across her face. Before either of us could utter another word, the heavy oak doors of the executive study clicked and slowly swung inward. The bright light from the hallway poured over us, slicing through the shadows. Vivian jumped back, frantically smoothing the front of her sequined gown and painting a desperate, artificial smile on her face, terrified that Eleanor Sterling had come to find her. But it was not Eleanor. It was Marcus. My husband stood in the doorway, his custom tuxedo perfectly pressed, holding a half-empty glass of imported champagne. He stepped into the room and quickly closed the door behind him, sealing the three of us inside the quiet, tense space. The final act of this miserable play had just walked onto the stage, and I was entirely prepared to watch him deliver his defining lines. Marcus stepped into the room, still holding a crystal glass filled with the sparkling champagne that I had paid for. He closed the heavy oak door, but the jazz music from the dazzling wedding pavilion outside still slipped through the cracks, acting like a mocking soundtrack to this suffocating scene. I stood perfectly still in the dark corner of the executive study, feeling the intense tension tightening around the three of us. Vivian immediately rushed toward her son, her trembling hand gripping his suit jacket sleeve, as if searching for a reliable ally to protect the desperate lie she had just constructed. If a camera were capturing this exact moment, it would begin a slow, circular tracking shot entirely around me. It would isolate my figure in the center of the room, while Marcus and his mother blurred into the background. That rotation perfectly mirrored the profound isolation and abandonment I was enduring from the very people I had called my family for the past 7 years. I stood there completely alone, without a single pillar of support, facing a betrayal taking shape right before my eyes. I looked directly into Marcus's eyes. He was my husband, the man I had invested my entire youth, my love and my massive fortune into protecting his pride and reputation. In that agonizingly long moment, I watched him actively avoid my gaze. His eyes darted nervously, looking down at the floor, glancing at the wall, staring into his glass, doing absolutely everything in his power to escape the naked truth standing right in front of him. I remained silent, patiently waiting. I was waiting for one word, one action, or even the smallest defense from this man. I wanted to see him display the backbone of a real husband, to stand up and tell his mother that she had permanently crossed the line when she degraded his wife in this very house. I thought about the last 7 years, about the sleepless nights I spent silently clearing his debts, about the times I willingly stepped into the background so he could shine as a successful gentleman. All of those sacrifices only required one single moment of him standing by my side today, cowardly and deeply selfish. Marcus did not do that. He took a step forward. The physical distance between us narrowed, but the emotional chasm expanded into an endless, bottomless void. He bowed his head, his shoulders slumping beneath his expensive tailored suit, completely losing the confident, arrogant posture he always paraded in front of his friends at the elite country club. He stepped closer to me, leaning in near my ear, and spoke. His voice was not the voice of a man outraged by injustice. It was a cowardly, trembling whisper filled with a pathetic, despicable plea. "Nia, I am begging you, please do not make a scene right now." Marcus pleaded, every single word, acting like a dull knife sawing at my self-worth. My mother is already incredibly stressed. You know how important Chloe's wedding is to our family. The Sterlings are right outside. They are true old money royalty from Boston. If they see you here, or if there is any kind of disturbance, everything my mother has built will completely fall apart. I am begging you, just cooperate this one time. Go around to the back door, take the route the catering staff uses, grab your documents, and leave this property as fast as you can. Please, I am on my knees here. Do not embarrass me in front of Bryce. I cannot let the Sterlings think the wife of a Washington bank executive is someone who does not know her proper place. Do not embarrass me in front of Bryce. His pathetic plea echoed in the quiet space of the room, carrying the ultimate humiliation. Marcus, my legal husband, was mentally kneeling before the wealth of a white stranger, and to do so, he was entirely willing to trample on the dignity of the wife who was currently funding his entire family's existence. He did not care how his mother had just insulted me. He did not care that I was being forced to use the servant's entrance. The only thing that existed in his selfish mind in that moment was his cheap, fragile social facade in front of the Sterlings. The imaginary camera continued its slow rotation around me, capturing the bitter contrast between my cold, motionless stance and Marcus's cowering, desperate posture. In that exact moment, I looked deep into my husband's cowardly eyes and realized this marriage was officially dead. Every tether of connection, every ounce of patience, and the final drop of forgiveness I held for him disintegrated into absolute ash. The man standing before me was not the partner I had sworn to build a life with. He was just a cowardly parasite, a puppet entirely manipulated by greed and the terrifying fear of losing his fake social status. Vivian, standing safely behind Marcus, heard her son's words and immediately regained the arrogant smirk on her face. She tilted her chin upward, her eyes gleaming with triumph, as if she had just been granted absolute power. She smoothed out the wrinkles in her shimmering silver gown, her tone shifting into a sickening, patronizing command. "You heard your husband, Nia. He is a practical man who knows how to prioritize the future of this family. Go out the back door right now. Do not let your rough appearance contaminate our elegant evening. Leave immediately before Eleanor walks in here." I did not say a single word. I did not bother explaining that this mega mansion belonged entirely to me, that the expensive wedding pavilion outside was sitting on my dirt, or that the money they were using to show off came directly from my accounts. All of that was irrelevant now. Marcus's betrayal had pushed this conflict past the point of no return, transforming a toxic family dynamic into an absolute war for survival and power. I looked directly at Marcus, then shifted my gaze to Vivian. The corners of my mouth slowly curled up into a faint, freezing smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just made the ultimate, unforgiving decision. It was a smile that made Marcus unconsciously shudder, even though he had no idea why. I tightened my grip on the leather tote bag holding my multi-million-dollar documents. Without looking back, I stepped right past my cowardly husband who was blocking the path. I did not take the back door through the servants' corridors as they demanded. I took long, powerful strides straight through the main executive doors, heading directly toward the dazzling grand foyer. Marcus and Vivian stood completely frozen in the study, staring in absolute panic at my retreating back, far too terrified to chase after me and risk alarming the wealthy guests outside. They thought I was retreating in humiliation and defeat. They thought my silence was a sign of surrender. They had absolutely no idea that by forcing me to use the back door of my own castle, they had personally signed the death warrant for their entire empire of lies. The clock had officially started counting down, and the next 60 minutes were about to become the most brutal, merciless hour the Washington family had ever experienced in their entire pathetic lives. I stopped dead in my tracks right at the edge of the grand foyer. The brilliant light from the massive crystal chandelier above cascaded over my shoulders, illuminating the deep emerald green of my custom silk dress. Behind me, I could hear the frantic, shuffling footsteps of Marcus and Vivian. They had chased me to the threshold of the executive study, absolutely terrified that I was about to burst onto the manicured lawn march into the glass pavilion and ruin their precious rehearsal dinner. They expected me to scream. They expected me to throw a hysterical fit, to demand immediate apologies, to weep uncontrollably over the brutal, degrading betrayal I had just endured. A traditional broken-hearted wife would have caused a massive scene. She would have shattered the imported vases and hurled insults that would echo through the entire neighborhood. But there was not a single tear in my eyes. There was no loud argument. There was no dramatic screaming match. In that precise, suspended moment, a profound and absolute silence enveloped my soul. If you were watching this unfold on a screen, the camera would be perfectly steady. It would freeze completely still, for 3 long, agonizing seconds, capturing the exact microscopic moment a 7-year marriage formally expired. Every ounce of love, every drop of patience, and every shred of respect I had ever held for Marcus simply died. It was a clinical, permanent death. The man standing a few feet behind me, panting in his custom tuxedo, with a look of cowardly panic plastered across his face, was no longer my partner. He was no longer the man I had sworn to protect and uplift. He was just a bad investment, and I am an absolute expert at liquidating bad investments. In the corporate world, when a hostile negotiation reaches a breaking point, you do not throw a tantrum. You do not flip the boardroom table. You simply gather your assets, identify the opposition's greatest vulnerability, and execute a strike so devastating they never even see the blade coming. Marcus had completely forgotten who he married. He saw a compliant wife to be managed entirely, forgetting about the venture capitalist who dismantled entire corporations before her morning coffee. I turned around slowly, my heels clicking with sharp, deliberate precision against the Italian marble floor. Marcus and Vivian froze instantly. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the doorway of the study, looking like 2 deer caught in the blinding headlights of a massive oncoming freight train. Vivian clutched the sequined fabric of her silver gown, her jaw tight with apprehension. Marcus held his hands up in a pathetic, placating gesture, his eyes silently begging me to keep my voice down. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer them the satisfaction of my anger. I looked directly into Marcus's terrified eyes, stripping away every boundary of intimacy we had ever shared. I looked at him not as a wife looking at a husband, but as a predator looking at prey. Then I shifted my gaze to Vivian, letting her see the sheer, unadulterated power radiating from my stance. I held their complete attention, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of my silence crush the air out of their lungs. Then I spoke exactly one word. Understood. It was not a statement of submission. It was a receipt. It was a verbal confirmation that the transaction was complete, the new terms had been accepted, and the bridge between us was officially burned to ash. The word hung in the chilled air of the grand foyer, sharp and lethal as a scalpel. Vivian blinked, visibly confused by my complete lack of resistance. Marcus let out a long, shaky breath, his shoulders dropping as he foolishly interpreted my calmness as compliance. He actually believed his pathetic plea had worked. He thought the crisis was averted, that the working-class girl from East Point had finally recognized her place and was backing down to protect his fragile social standing in front of the Boston elite. He thought my silence was the white flag of surrender. If the camera were watching me now, it would slowly begin to elevate. It would pedestal up, rising higher and higher toward the vaulted ceiling to emphasize the towering, untouchable authority I possessed as I executed my final maneuver. I turned on my heel, offering them my back one final time. I adjusted the strap of my leather tote bag on my shoulder, feeling the solid, comforting weight of the merger documents and the absolute power resting inside. I did not scurry toward the kitchen. I did not duck my head and slink away through the servant corridors like they had so arrogantly demanded. I walked with the slow, measured, majestic grace of a queen surveying her newly conquered territory. I headed directly for the massive custom-carved mahogany front doors. I walked right past the towering floral arrangements that Eleanor Sterling had carefully selected and placed in my hallway. I glided over the antique Persian rugs that my money had paid for. I moved with a terrifying serenity, my head held high, my posture impeccable, claiming the space that was legally rightfully mine. Behind me, I could feel their shocked, confused stares burning into my back. They were completely paralyzed, unable to process the elegant defiance of my exit. They had demanded I use the back door to hide my existence from their wealthy guests, and instead, I was taking the grandest exit possible, leaving my own $5.5 million castle on my own uncompromising terms. They were too stunned to chase me, too terrified of causing a scene to stop me. I reached the heavy brass handles of the front doors. I did not look back. I pulled the door open, letting the humid music-filled Atlanta night air rush into the sterile, tense foyer. The jazz quartet on the south lawn was playing a lively, upbeat tempo, completely oblivious to the silent execution that had just taken place inside the house. I stepped out onto the wide stone porch, the heavy doors clicking firmly shut behind me, sealing Marcus and Vivienne inside their beautiful, expensive tomb. I walked down the sweeping front steps, my heels ringing out clearly into the night, and headed down the long, tree-lined driveway toward my parked car. The air outside felt incredibly crisp and clean. The suffocating toxicity of the Washington family was no longer clinging to my skin. I slid into the driver's seat of my Maybach, the quiet luxury of the leather interior wrapping around me like an armored shield. I placed my tote bag on the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel. I did not start the engine immediately. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting the reality of my newly reclaimed freedom wash over every nerve in my body. The profound grief of a failed marriage was completely overshadowed by the cold, exhilarating thrill of the impending retaliation. They had given me their absolute worst. They had shown me exactly who they were, what they valued, and how incredibly little my loyalty meant to them. They had handed me the moral clearance to destroy them without a single ounce of guilt or hesitation. Marcus wanted me to understand my place. Vivienne wanted me to understand the strict hierarchy of their fake elite world. I understood perfectly. I understood that they were parasites living on borrowed time and my stolen capital. And as I sat in the dark interior of my car, looking up at the glowing glass pavilion, where they were currently toasting to their fake generational wealth, I prepared to show them exactly what I had understood. The era of my silent, charitable funding was permanently over. The era of my ruthless, calculated retribution had officially begun. The heavy door of this Maybach sealed shut with a satisfying vault-like thud. The thick, soundproof glass instantly severed me from the humid night air and the faint jazz melodies drifting from the estate. The world outside tilted. If a camera were capturing this moment, the angle would sharply shift off its axis, a subtle, disorienting slant signaling that the ground beneath the Washington family was rapidly breaking apart. The slow, methodical pacing of my retreat vanished. The time for elegant silence was over. The execution phase demanded speed, precision, and absolute ruthlessness. I reached into the passenger seat, unzipped my designer tote, and pulled out my silver laptop. I flipped it open. The stark blue-white glow of the screen illuminated the dark interior of the car, casting sharp shadows across my face. My fingers flew across the keyboard with rapid, punishing speed. I did not shed a single tear. My heart rate was steady thumping with the cold, measured adrenaline of a predator closing its jaws. I synced my phone to the car's secure Bluetooth system and dialed my lead trust attorney. His name was Harrison. He managed the legal architecture for my entire venture capital portfolio. He was ruthless, brilliant, and awake regardless of the hour. The encrypted line rang exactly twice before he answered. "Good evening, Nia," Harrison said, his voice crisp and alert despite the late hour. "I assume this is not a social call." "Pull up the Buckhead estate file immediately," I commanded, my voice snapping through the car speakers with absolute authority. "Access the specific occupancy agreement executed by Vivienne Washington. We have a catastrophic breach of contract, and I need to confirm the exact parameters of the kill switch." I heard the rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard on his end. Harrison did not ask questions, he simply executed orders. Within 10 seconds, he had the highly classified trust documents displayed on his monitors. "I have the file open," Harrison confirmed. "Let us review the primary structure. As per your strict instructions during the acquisition, your anonymous holding company is the sole owner of the property. Marcus Washington holds zero equity and zero legal claim. Vivienne Washington is classified exclusively as a tenant at will." A tenant at will. The legal designation was the ultimate invisible guillotine hanging directly over my mother-in-law's carefully highlighted head. In the state of Georgia, a standard lease provides a tenant with substantial protections, mandatory notice periods, and drawn-out eviction processes. But a tenant at will occupying a property under a highly conditional non-standard luxury agreement enjoys absolutely none of those safety nets. They exist on the property entirely by the grace of the owner, and my grace had just permanently expired. "Read me the specific stipulations under Section 4. I instructed, my eyes flicking up to the rearview mirror. I could still see the warm golden glow of the rehearsal dinner illuminating the night sky behind me. They were toasting to their fake generational wealth, completely unaware that their landlord was sitting at the end of the driveway loading the legal ammunition. Harrison cleared his throat and began reading the airtight legal trap I had meticulously designed weeks ago. Section 4, Paragraph A, outlines the morality clause. The occupant shall not engage in any behavior that brings public disrepute, scandal, or damage to the reputation of the holding company. Paragraph B outlines property utilization. The occupant is strictly prohibited from utilizing the residential premises for any commercial enterprise, public event, or large-scale gathering exceeding 20 individuals without explicit prior written authorization from the legal property owner. I smiled. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing perfection. "Harrison," I said, leaning closer to the dashboard microphone. "They currently have over 200 guests standing on the south lawn. They have erected a massive commercial-grade glass pavilion. There are Michelin-starred caterers operating industrial kitchens in the driveway. They have installed professional lighting rigs, a live jazz quartet, and a custom dance floor. They are hosting a multi-$100,000 wedding on my property. Have they submitted any written requests for a commercial event of this magnitude?" I heard Harrison let out a low, sharp breath. "I can confirm the holding company has received absolutely zero written requests. There are no approved event permits on file with our office. This is not just a minor infraction, Nia. Operating a commercial-scale event of this magnitude on a restricted residential property is a massive, egregious violation of the occupancy agreement. They have completely breached the contract." "What is the exact penalty for a breach of this scale?" I asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear the legal confirmation echo through the car. "Immediate termination of the tenancy agreement," Harrison replied, without a single second of hesitation. "Because of the scale of the unapproved commercial activity and the liability it places on your holding company, the tenant at will status is legally voided effective immediately. You possess the absolute legal right to issue an emergency cease and desist and an immediate eviction notice." I tapped my manicured fingernails against the leather steering wheel. The rhythm was fast matching the racing calculations in my mind. Marcus thought he had secured a miracle mortgage. Vivian thought she had inherited a castle. Neither of them had bothered to hire a competent lawyer to read the fine print of the documents they had so desperately signed. They were so blinded by their insatiable greed and their frantic desire to impress the Boston elite that they had blindly signed their names to a contract designed specifically to ruin them. "Draft the emergency cease and desist immediately," I ordered. "I do not want a warning. I do not want a 30-day grace period. I want a complete, immediate, and hostile shutdown of the entire property. Draft the eviction notice for Vivian Washington and Marcus Washington. Consider it done," Harrison said, the sound of his rapid typing filling the silence. "When do you want this executed?" "Tomorrow morning," I replied, my voice dropping to a glacial, terrifying calm. "At exactly 10 o'clock. I want the papers served right as the elite guests arrive for the wedding ceremony. I want the Sterling family, the Boston billionaires, and every single high society snob in Atlanta to be standing on the lawn when it happens." Harrison paused for a fraction of a second, fully grasping the absolute brutal devastation of my timing. "Do you want to involve local law enforcement to ensure compliance?" "Absolutely," I confirmed. "This is not a polite request. They are currently trespassing on my property and operating an illegal commercial event." "Contact the county sheriff's office. Inform them that the property owner requires an immediate civil standby to enforce an emergency eviction and halt an unauthorized gathering. Spare absolutely no legal expense. I want squad cars. I want official uniforms. I want the maximum legal force deployed to my front gates. I will have a senior partner from our litigation team meet the sheriff's deputies at the property tomorrow morning," Harrison assured me. "The documents will be flawless. The Washington family will not have a single legal loophole to crawl through. By 10:15 tomorrow morning, they will be legally ordered to vacate the premises." "Excellent," I said. "Send me the digital copies for final approval within the hour." "Good night, Harrison." I disconnected the call. The sudden silence in the Maybach was deafening, but it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I looked back at the glowing estate in my rearview mirror one last time. Vivian was likely still pouring champagne, convinced she had won the ultimate victory by banishing me to the shadows. Marcus was probably patting himself on the back, believing his cowardly whispers had successfully managed his embarrassing wife. They had no idea that their entire world was running on a ticking timer. I had just armed the nuclear warhead. I reached for the gear shift, threw the heavy luxury vehicle into drive, and pressed my foot down hard on the accelerator. The powerful engine roared to life, propelling me down the dark, tree-lined street, carrying me away from the toxic illusion and straight toward my ultimate retribution. The legal foundation of their destruction was officially set in stone, but I was not entirely finished yet. Taking their fake mansion was simply the first phase. Now I needed to completely sever the financial arteries that had been keeping their pathetic, parasitic lifestyle alive for the past 7 years. I picked up my phone again, preparing to make the second phone call of the night. If the camera were capturing this exact sequence, the perspective would dramatically shift into a tight, extreme close-up. The lens would focus entirely on my hands, my manicured fingers gliding across the illuminated keyboard of my laptop with the practiced lethal precision of a surgeon. The camera would execute a very slow, deliberate pan across the dashboard of the Maybach, capturing the icy blue light of the screen reflecting off my diamond engagement ring. It was a massive, flawless stone that Marcus had proudly bragged about buying for me to all of his country club friends, conveniently omitting the fact that I had quietly transferred the exact purchase amount into his checking account the day before he went to the jeweler. I did not dial a standard customer service hotline. When you control the kind of capital that I do, you completely bypass the automated menus and the entry-level representatives. I utilized my encrypted connection to reach my dedicated private wealth concierge at an elite international banking institution. The line connected instantly, the silence of the car broken by a crisp professional voice. "Good evening, Ms. Washington. How may our office assist you tonight?" The concierge asked, his tone perfectly calibrated to handle high net worth demands at any hour. "Effective immediately, initiate a total unyielding freeze on all supplementary accounts linked to my primary portfolio," I instructed. My voice was stripped of any emotion, echoing with cold, clinical authority. To fully comprehend the absolute devastation of this specific maneuver, you have to understand the pathetic reality of Marcus's financial existence. Marcus walked around Atlanta projecting the flawless image of a highly successful, aggressively wealthy banking executive. He wore custom imported suits, drove a leased Aston Martin, and loved nothing more than throwing down a heavy matte black credit card at exclusive steakhouses to impress his colleagues and Bryce Sterling. He carried himself with the arrogant swagger of a man who commanded the universe. What his colleagues, his mother, and the Sterling family absolutely did not know was that the black card did not belong to him. His own banking credentials were a complete and utter joke. Early in our marriage, Marcus's aggressive, foolish attempts to play the stock market and invest in doomed commercial real estate ventures had nearly bankrupted him. His debt-to-income ratio was so disastrous that he could not even secure a standard auto loan without a cosigner. I had become that cosigner. I had taken pity on his bruised ego and linked his financial identity to my heavily fortified assets. I provided the astronomical collateral that allowed him to maintain his VIP banking status. I established the supplementary cards with massive limits so he would never have to feel emasculated in front of his peers. I was the silent, invisible engine powering his entire fake reality. I was the life support system keeping the Washington family name breathing, and I was about to pull the plug. I need you to revoke all authorizations for Marcus Washington, I continued, my eyes fixed on the digital readouts on my screen. Decline any pending authorizations that have not legally cleared. Cancel all active physical cards bearing his name and lock the joint checking accounts pending a formal marital dissolution. I want his spending limit reduced to 0 immediately. I heard the rapid, efficient tapping of a keyboard on the other end of the line. Understood, Ms. Washington, the concierge confirmed. All supplementary cards are now officially inactive. I am seeing several massive holds placed on the secondary card ending in 402 within the last 48 hours. Would you like me to review these pending authorizations with you? Read them to me, I commanded. The concierge began listing off the recent charges, and a dark, triumphant satisfaction bloomed in my chest. There were thousands of dollars authorized to a luxury black car service undoubtedly used to transport the Sterling family and their aristocratic relatives from the airport in high-class style. There was a staggering deposit placed to the Michelin-starred catering company currently operating out of my driveway, intended to cover the exorbitant cost of the rehearsal dinner and tomorrow's reception menu. There was a massive hold placed by a 5-star luxury hotel in downtown Atlanta, where Marcus had proudly booked multiple penthouse suites for Bryce's extended family overflow. Cancel every single hold that has not been legally finalized. I ordered without a fraction of hesitation. If a vendor attempts to run that card tomorrow morning to settle the remaining wedding balances, I want the transaction hard declined. Consider it done, the concierge replied. His financial access has been entirely severed. I disconnected the call and closed the laptop, the screen clicking shut with a sharp, definitive snap. The digital execution was complete. The financial arteries that had been sustaining their pathetic parasitic lifestyle for the past 7 years were permanently severed. The sheer catastrophic brilliance of this maneuver was almost too beautiful to articulate. Marcus had promised the Sterlings the absolute world. He and Vivian had guaranteed that the Washington family would graciously cover the exorbitant costs of hosting their aristocratic relatives in Atlanta, desperate to prove that they were financial equals. Marcus had swiped that black card with complete arrogance, believing my capital was an endless well he could draw from to fund his vanity. He called me a ghetto embarrassment. He told me I was unfit to stand in the presence of old money. Yet he was literally using my money to buy the food they were eating, the cars they were riding in, and the beds they were sleeping in. By tomorrow morning, the financial reality was going to crush him with the force of a falling building. When the elite caterers demanded their final payment before serving the reception dinner, Marcus would confidently hand them a piece of useless deactivated plastic. When the luxury transportation company tried to charge the card for shuttling the Boston billionaires to the wedding venue, the system would reject it. When the downtown hotel attempted to authorize the final bill for the Sterling family suites, They would lock Bryce's aristocratic relatives out of their rooms for an invalid payment method. Marcus was about to experience the most visceral, humiliating form of public exposure possible. He had built his entire massive ego around being a provider, a man of profound means who could effortlessly navigate the highest echelons of society. He had banished me to the shadows so I would not ruin his perfect image. Now I was stripping him down to his actual net worth, exposing him to the very people he worshipped. He was going to have to look Eleanor Sterling in the eyes and explain why his credit cards were declining at his own sister's luxury wedding. I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest of the Maybach, letting the absolute silence of the car wrap around me. I had taken their fake mansion. I had destroyed their credit. I had meticulously loaded every single chamber of the gun. The Washington family wanted to show the Boston elite exactly what kind of people they were. By tomorrow morning, the Sterlings would see them clearly. They would not see Southern royalty. They would see broke, fraudulent, pathetic parasites. The trap was set, the execution was scheduled, and all I had to do now was wait for the sun to rise. The camera slowly pulls back, revealing the sprawling, luxurious interior of the Maybach. It captures my silhouette enveloped in the quiet darkness. I leaned back against the premium leather seat, my hands resting comfortably clasped in my lap, completely mastering the battlefield. The warm, ambient lighting of the car illuminated my face, highlighting the cold, proud composure of a woman holding every winning card. A sharp notification pinged on my laptop screen. It was an email from Harrison, carrying 2 attached PDF files stamped with the red seals of the court and the law firm. The cease and desist order, commanding the immediate halt of all unauthorized activities, along with the emergency eviction notice, had been flawlessly executed and officially approved. Every single line of legal jargon on those documents was sharp and lethal, acting as an absolute death sentence for the Washington family's delusions. The justification provided in the filings was undeniable and designed for total annihilation. Marcus's family had severely violated the designated use of a private residential property. They had independently established and operated a massive unauthorized commercial event without a single shred of written consent from the legal owner, which was my investment fund. They had transformed a $5.5 million estate into a colossal flashy wedding venue for over 200 people, completely shattering every strict security, privacy, and morality clause I had meticulously woven into their tenant-at-will occupancy agreement. My master plan never stopped at merely ruining Chloe's spectacular wedding or humiliating Vivian. If I only kicked out the florists or forced them to tear down the glass pavilion on the lawn, it would have been far too lenient. It would not have been nearly enough to wash away the brutal degradation I had endured for 7 long years, especially the cowardly, pathetic whispers of my husband in the dark study earlier tonight. I wanted so much more than that. I wanted total, comprehensive collapse. I wanted a radical eradication straight from the roots. I wanted to strip away every ounce of their standing, expose their naked deceit, and throw this entire parasitic family out onto the street today. They wanted me to shrink myself, to disappear through the back door like a hired servant, so I would not stain their fake elegance in front of the Boston elite. So I was going to show them exactly what true elegance and absolute power looked like when they were physically dragged out of a castle they had never owned a single brick of. I swiped my finger across the trackpad, slowly reading over the eviction terms, savoring the flawless, unfeeling nature of the American legal system. The documents explicitly mandated that as of 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, all temporary residency rights granted to Vivian Washington and Marcus Washington at this address were permanently and irrevocably revoked due to contract violations. They were not granted 30 days to pack. They were given no grace period, and they had absolutely no right to file an emergency appeal. Any personal belongings left inside the house after 10:15 would be legally sealed and confiscated. Chloe's multi-$100,000 dream wedding, that glorious glass pavilion, the rare imported white orchids, all of it would instantly become illegal debris sitting on my private property. Marcus's family had spent an entire year preparing for this exact event, lying about their pedigree, erasing the images of their ancestors, and degrading the very daughter-in-law who kept them from starving all to buy a nod of approval from Eleanor Sterling. They genuinely thought that merging with a white billionaire bloodline from Boston was their golden ticket into an untouchable echelon of society. They were so arrogant that they did not even bother reading the intricate legal documents I had placed in front of them, blindly handing over their entire destiny without a second thought. Their blinding pride and prejudice had turned them into foolish puppets in a tragedy I had personally scripted and directed. Harrison had done an exceptional job coordinating directly with the county sheriff's office to arrange an emergency civil enforcement team. Tomorrow morning, instead of sleek luxury limousines or vibrant bridal cars, the front lawn of the Buckhead estate would be greeted by 3 police patrol cruisers with their authoritative lights flashing. My legal team would be standing right at the main gates, clutching the eviction orders, reading them aloud in front of all the VIP guests, the local media, and the Sterling family. The fabricated myth of the elite old money Washington family would be ruthlessly torn apart at the absolute peak of their ostentatious display. Marcus wanted to protect his fragile ego in front of Bryce Sterling by forcing his wife to use the servants' entrance. He was fully prepared to choose the validation of a white stranger and turn his back on the woman who had pulled him out of the abyss of bankruptcy. Tomorrow morning, I would make him stand face to face with that very same man in front of his sister's millionaire fiancé and explain exactly why he and his mother were being escorted out the front doors by law enforcement with absolutely nothing to their names, while every single one of his credit cards screamed declined. This was not a spontaneous emotional act of revenge filled with cheap shouting. It was a systematic clinical punishment with zero room for mercy. I closed the laptop, setting it on the passenger seat, and looked out the tinted window of the Maybach. The brilliant lights from their wedding pavilion still illuminated a corner of the night sky, and the distant clinking of crystal glasses echoed like a final defiant challenge from the opposition before the velvet curtain fell. I smoothed a crease in my blazer, feeling an absolute profound peace wrapping around my soul. This battle had been brewing for far too long, and every single chess piece was finally in its rightful place. I had given them every opportunity to treat me like a human being, like a true member of their family for 7 years, but they consistently chose greed and hollow vanity. Now they were going to have to learn how to survive the catastrophic fallout of their own choices. I pressed the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life with a smooth, quiet purr inside the luxury cabin. The vehicle slowly rolled forward, gliding past the custom wrought iron gates of the estate, carrying the true master of this domain away from the scene to prepare for the glorious spectacle tomorrow morning. I did not need to be physically present to watch them weep or beg. The law and my representatives would execute my justice with surgical precision. The Washington family wanted to play a ruthless game of power and status, and they made the fatal mistake of challenging the only person capable of stripping them of everything. Dawn was approaching, and this Saturday was going to be the day the name Nia Washington became a terrifying legend and the most expensive lesson for anyone who ever dared to underestimate the power of an independent woman. The digital clock on my monitoring screen shifted to precisely 10 in the morning. Outside, it was the kind of pristine, cloudless sun-drenched Saturday that luxury wedding planners charge an exorbitant premium to guarantee. If a camera were capturing this exact moment, it would execute a remarkably slow, agonizingly smooth tracking shot, gliding flawlessly across the meticulously manicured south lawn of the Buckhead estate. The lens would capture a cinematic masterpiece of pure, unadulterated delusion. I sat comfortably in the leather chair of my downtown office, watching this entire spectacle unfold in glorious 4K resolution through the covert high-definition security cameras I had ordered installed along the roofline the day I closed on the property. The scene on my monitor was sickeningly perfect. The sprawling green lawn had been transformed into an aristocratic wonderland. Hundreds of white wooden folding chairs were arranged with geometric precision on either side of a long, pristine white runner. Towering floral arches dripping with thousands of imported white orchids and rare hydrangeas framed the altar. Under the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree, a professional string quartet was playing a soft, classical symphony that drifted elegantly through the warm morning air. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated silently among the guests, balancing polished silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne. It was the absolute pinnacle of high society elegance. It was also the most expensive, elaborate crime scene in the entire state of Georgia. The crowd mingling on my lawn was a fascinating, pathetic sociological study of wealth and pretense. On the right side of the aisle stood the Sterling family and their formidable Boston contingent. They were a sea of muted pastels, tailored linen suits, and generations of inherited arrogance. They sipped their sparkling water and exchanged quiet, knowing glances, carrying themselves with the unquestionable authority of true old money. On the left side of the aisle was the carefully curated Atlanta elite. Vivienne had invited local politicians, prominent country club socialites, and affluent business owners, desperately packing the guest list with anyone who could witness and validate her ultimate social ascension. The two worlds were blending together on my grass-shaking hands and murmuring their praises for the breathtaking venue. And right there, planted firmly in the very center of this grand illusion, was Vivienne Washington. The tracking camera of my security system slowly zoomed in on my mother-in-law. She was radiating an almost blinding level of artificial joy. She wore a custom-tailored champagne-colored designer gown that hugged her figure perfectly, a dress she had undoubtedly charged to one of Marcus's now completely deactivated black cards. Her hair was styled into an immaculate updo and a string of pearls rested against her collarbone. She was holding court like a conquering queen. She floated effortlessly between groups of Boston billionaires and Atlanta elites, her manicured fingers tightly gripping a champagne flute as she pointed proudly toward the soaring columns of the main house. I could practically hear the script she was reciting. I watched her lips move as she stood with Eleanor Sterling and a group of wealthy northern investors. She was weaving a magnificent fabricated tale about the history of the property. She was undoubtedly telling them how her late husband used to walk these very grounds, how the majestic oak trees were planted by Marcus's great-grandfather, and how profoundly thrilled she was to host this sacred family union at their beloved ancestral estate. Her performance was absolutely breathtaking. The sheer conviction in her posture, the graceful sweep of her arm as she claimed ownership of my $5.5 million purchase, deserved an Academy Award. She was entirely intoxicated by her own lie, deeply convinced that she had successfully orchestrated the social coup of the century. A few yards away, standing near the outdoor bar, Marcus was playing his designated role flawlessly. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Bryce and the groomsmen, throwing his head back in laughter at some polite joke. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo, projecting the image of a wildly successful banking executive and a generous host. He looked incredibly relieved. He looked exactly like a man who genuinely believed he had successfully neutralized a massive disaster the night before. He actually thought he had banished his embarrassing working-class wife to the shadows and secured his family's flawless reputation. He was sipping his top-shelf bourbon, greeting billionaires with a confident smile, entirely unaware that his financial life support had been permanently terminated at midnight. He thought he was the king welcoming distinguished guests to his castle. He was actually just a broke trespasser standing on top of a highly volatile ticking time bomb. I switched the camera feed to the upper balcony. Inside the master suite on the second floor, looking down through the massive bay windows, was Chloe, the bride. She was surrounded by a frantic team of makeup artists and hairstylists doing their final touch-ups. She was draped in her aggressively conservative, high-necked lace gown, the exact dress Eleanor Sterling had selected to ensure Chloe looked sufficiently refined for Boston high society. Chloe was staring out at the massive crowd gathering on the lawn, her face glowing with pure, unadulterated triumph. She believed she had finally made it. She believed she had officially crossed the threshold into the untouchable realm of the ultra-wealthy. She was just minutes away from walking down that perfectly manicured aisle and securing her billionaire future. Everything on my monitor was absolutely flawless. The lighting was perfect, the music was enchanting, and the atmosphere was dripping with exclusive prestige. It was the exact physical manifestation of the Washington family's greatest, most desperate desires. They had successfully fooled the Sterlings. They had successfully impressed the Atlanta elite. They had successfully hidden their bankrupt, debt-ridden reality behind the towering stone walls of a mega mansion they did not own. They felt completely invincible. They were basking in the glorious golden dawn of their absolute deceit. They were standing on the absolute highest peak of their imaginary social ladder, looking down at the world, believing they had won the ultimate victory. But this is the fundamental, catastrophic problem with building an empire entirely out of lies. The higher you build the illusion, the more spectacular and devastating the collapse will be. They were all standing on a stage that I legally owned, performing a script that I was about to tear into a million microscopic pieces. I sat back in my chair and watched the guests begin to take their seats. The string quartet shifted their melody, signaling the beginning of the ceremony. The officiant stepped up to the floral altar. The perfect morning of their absolute deceit had reached its glorious peak. I took a deep breath, folded my hands on my desk, and waited for the show to truly begin. The string quartet smoothly transitioned into the opening chords of the bridal chorus. 200 distinguished guests rose to their feet in perfect unison, their expensive silk garments rustling softly in the warm Atlanta breeze. All eyes turned toward the heavy mahogany doors of the main house, waiting for Chloe to make her grand, triumphant entrance. Vivian stood near the front row, her hands clasped tightly together, tears of manufactured joy brimming in her eyes. Marcus stood proudly next to Bryce at the altar, puffing out his chest, ready to welcome his new billionaire brother-in-law into the family. The illusion was flawless. It was the exact crowning moment of their absolute social victory. Then the heavy iron gates at the bottom of the driveway violently swung open. It was not the bride making her entrance. The deafening, piercing wail of police sirens suddenly shattered the pristine morning air, slicing through the delicate classical music like a jagged blade. The ground beneath the guests literally vibrated as 3 heavy-duty county sheriff patrol cruisers roared up the sweeping circular driveway. Their intense red and blue emergency lights flashed erratically, reflecting off the glass walls of the massive wedding pavilion. Right behind the police cruisers was a sleek, black-armored SUV. The vehicles did not politely park at the valet station. They completely ignored the designated zone's tires crunching aggressively over the imported white flower petals scattered across the pavement. The lead sheriff cruiser drove straight onto the meticulously manicured south lawn, coming to a sharp, halting stop just yards away from the pristine white aisle. If you were watching this unfold through a camera lens, the shot would drop to eye level right now. It would begin a relentless, rhythmic push forward, stepping in perfect time with the pounding heartbeats of the terrified guests. Total absolute chaos instantly infected the crowd. The string quartet fumbled, the cellist dragging his bow across the strings in a harsh, screeching discord, before the music died completely. Wealthy socialites gasped, clutching their designer handbags. The Sterling family contingent from Boston froze in sheer, unadulterated horror. In their untouchable world of old money and quiet privilege, law enforcement simply did not crash private garden parties. It was the ultimate, unforgivable social taboo. Vivienne dropped her champagne flute. The expensive crystal shattered against the stone patio, but nobody even noticed the sound. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. Marcus stepped forward from the altar, his hands trembling, his carefully constructed posture completely collapsing. Bryce looked around in absolute bewilderment, searching the crowd for an explanation that did not exist. The doors of the black SUV swung open. My lead trust attorney Harrison stepped out onto the grass. He was flanked by 2 junior partners carrying thick black leather legal binders. They moved with the cold mechanical precision of an execution squad. At the same time, the county sheriff stepped out of his cruiser. He did not look intimidated by the wealth surrounding him. He looked annoyed, holding a heavy black megaphone in his right hand. The camera pushes in closer, step by step, right up the center of the white aisle. The sheriff raised the megaphone to his mouth. A sharp burst of static crackled through the air, completely silencing the murmuring crowd. By order of the county court, Everyone remain exactly where you are, the sheriff commanded, his booming voice echoing off the stone walls of the mansion. This is an active civil enforcement operation. All unauthorized activities on this property are hereby suspended effectively immediately. Eleanor Sterling clutched her pearls, her jaw dropping in genuine shock. Guests began to whisper frantically. What was happening? Was this a raid? Had someone committed a crime? Harrison did not wait for the whispers to settle. He marched directly up the pristine white runner, his expensive leather shoes stepping right over the scattered orchids. He completely ignored the Boston billionaires. He ignored the Atlanta elite. He did not stop until he was standing face to face with Vivian Marcus and Bryce at the floral altar. Vivian frantically rushed forward, trying to block Harrison from the microphone stand. "Excuse me," she hissed, her voice shaking violently as she attempted to maintain a shred of her aristocratic persona. "Who do you think you are? This is a private, highly exclusive family event. You are trespassing on Washington family property. I demand that you leave before I call the authorities." Harrison looked down at her with a chilling clinical detachment. He opened his black leather binder, pulled out the thick stack of court-stamped documents, and held them up for everyone to see. He did not lower his voice. He projected his words perfectly so that every single high society guest in the front rows could hear his devastating decree. "I am the chief legal counsel for the investment fund that legally owns this entire estate," Harrison stated, his voice echoing with absolute uncompromising authority. "And you, Mrs. Washington, are the one trespassing." A collective gasp rippled through the front rows of the audience. Bryce Sterling turned to Marcus, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to lie, to formulate any kind of pathetic excuse, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in the inescapable spotlight of his own deceit. Harrison turned to face the stunned crowd, making sure the Sterling family heard every single syllable of his next sentence. "Let the record show clearly and publicly," Harrison announced. "Vivian Washington and Marcus Washington do not own a single inch of this real estate. They hold absolutely no equity, no deed, and no legal claim to this $5.5 million property. They are illegally residing on a residential asset funded and controlled entirely by my client, Mrs. Nia Washington." The silence that fell over the lawn was deafening. It was not just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum where oxygen no longer existed. Eleanor Sterling swayed slightly on her feet, leaning heavily against her husband. The aristocratic Boston family, who had spent the last 48 hours looking down their noses at everyone else, suddenly realized they had been completely and utterly conned by a family of broke, desperate pretenders. "This is a lie," Vivian shrieked. Her carefully modulated, breathy voice vanished completely, replaced by a raw, guttural panic. She clawed at Harrison's arm. "Marcus, tell them. Tell them this is our house. Tell them you bought this for us. Tell them this is a terrible mistake." Marcus could not look at his mother. He could not look at Bryce. He stared down at his imported Italian leather shoes, his silence acting as a booming, undeniable confession. Harrison shook off Vivian's hand with clear disgust. He turned back to the crowd, delivering the final fatal blow. By operating a massive unauthorized commercial event on private residential grounds, the Washingtons have egregiously violated their temporary occupancy agreement. Therefore, the court has granted an emergency eviction and a strict cease and desist order. My client has terminated all financial support and revoked all property access. Harrison closed his binder with a sharp, resounding snap. Every floral arrangement, every catering station, and every structural modification on this lawn is now classified as illegal debris, Harrison declared. Mingle time is over. The wedding is officially canceled. By order of the county court, every single person on this lawn has exactly 15 minutes to vacate the premises before law enforcement begins issuing citations for criminal trespassing. The 15-minute countdown hung over the manicured lawn like a sudden and absolute death sentence. Through my high-definition monitors, I watched the visceral destruction of the Washington family play out in brutal, glorious real time. Eleanor Sterling did not scream or cause a theatrical scene. That is the true nature of old money. Their anger is completely silent, and therefore infinitely more lethal. Eleanor slowly turned her head and looked directly at Vivian. The sheer glacial disgust in her eyes was enough to freeze the thick Atlanta humidity. She looked at her future-in-law not as a human being, but as a repulsive diseased insect that had somehow crawled onto her expensive shoes. Bryce Sterling finally moved. The billionaire heir who had spent the last year treating my husband like a slightly amusing charity case stepped away from the floral altar. He did not look heartbroken. He looked profoundly humiliated. To a family like the Sterlings, marrying someone without wealth was a minor social scandal. Marrying a family of desperate, lying, fraudulent squatters was an unforgivable stain on their dynastic legacy. Bryce looked at Chloe, who was now weeping hysterically on the marble steps in her high-necked lace gown. He did not offer her a handkerchief. He did not reach out to comfort her. Instead, Bryce reached up to his lapel. With a single sharp motion, he ripped the imported white orchid boutonniere from his custom tuxedo jacket. He dropped the crushed flower onto the pristine white runner, letting it fall exactly where my lawyer had just trampled. The message was unmistakable. The engagement was permanently terminated. Bryce turned his back on a sobbing Chloe, walked briskly toward his horrified parents, and escorted his family straight toward the massive iron gates. Following their lead, the entire Boston contingent rose from their folding chairs and began a swift, synchronized exodus. They did not say goodbye. They simply evacuated the premises, desperate to distance themselves from the toxic fallout of the Washington fraud. Panic finally broke through Marcus's paralysis. My soon-to-be ex-husband snapped out of his catatonic state and launched into full survival mode. He saw the wealthy Atlanta socialites murmuring behind their hands, snapping photos of his family's public execution. He saw the sheriff's deputies unholstering their radios to coordinate the eviction. Desperation completely overrode his common sense. He frantically chased after the lead event coordinator and the catering manager, waving his hands wildly. I turned the audio feed up to maximum volume, savoring every pathetic syllable of his downfall. Marcus was sweating profusely, his expensive tuxedo jacket stained with perspiration. He was begging the vendors to ignore the police. He frantically reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his sleek, heavy, matte black credit card. The very same card I had personally funded and systematically deactivated just hours ago. "Run the card for the full balance right now," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "I can pay the fines. I can cover the city permits. Just swipe the card and tell the sheriff we have the capital to keep the pavilion standing. We can salvage the reception. Please just process the payment." The catering manager, looking extremely skeptical, pulled out a mobile point-of-sale terminal. He took the heavy metal card from Marcus's trembling hand and inserted the chip. For 3 agonizing seconds, the machine processed the transaction. Then a sharp, flat beep echoed through the microphone. "Declined," the manager stated dryly. Marcus snatched the card back, his eyes bulging with sheer terror. "That is impossible. It is a premium account. Try the other one." He fumbled with his leather wallet, producing a secondary platinum card, another piece of plastic directly tethered to my newly locked accounts. The manager swiped the second card. Another sharp, unforgiving beep rang out. "Declined again, sir. I am going to have to ask my staff to begin breaking down the buffet stations. We cannot leave unpaid equipment on an unsecured, disputed property." That single electronic beep was the final nail in the Washington family coffin. Marcus staggered backward, as if he had been physically struck. The truth finally crashed down upon him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He realized in that exact horrifying moment that I had not just taken the house, I had severed the absolute lifeblood of his entire fake existence. He had absolutely zero leverage, zero capital, and zero power. He was nothing but a broke, unemployed fraud standing on another woman's lawn in a rented tuxedo. The absolute dismantling of their dream accelerated rapidly. The sheriff deputies began ushering the remaining Atlanta elite off the premises, threatening anyone who lingered with trespassing citations. The florists mercilessly ripped down the towering arches of white orchids, tossing them carelessly into the backs of transport vans. The Michelin-starred catering staff aggressively packed up the silver chafing dishes, dumping hundreds of pounds of gourmet food directly into heavy-duty trash bags. The magical glass pavilion was systematically stripped down to its bare metal bones. Vivienne Washington collapsed onto the grass. The woman who had spent 7 years calling me a ghetto embarrassment was now weeping uncontrollably on the dirt, her designer gown stained with mud and crushed flower petals. She had lost her ancestral home. She had lost her social standing. She had lost the billionaire son-in-law, who was supposed to be her ultimate salvation. She was entirely bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and legally homeless. If a camera were capturing my reaction in the quiet sanctuary of my downtown office, it would execute a flawless, deliberate movement right now. It would slowly pedestal up, rising smoothly from the level of my sleek desk. As the camera elevated, it would push in steadily, bringing the lens intimately close to my face. The warm ambient lighting of the room would shift, focusing entirely on my expression. There was no anger left in my eyes. There was no lingering trace of a broken heart. There was only a radiant, deeply satisfying, entirely triumphant smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just successfully amputated a parasitic infection from her life. I had reclaimed my time, my dignity, and my empire. I watched the chaotic, miserable aftermath on the monitors one last time before calmly reaching forward and shutting the laptop screen. The feed cut to black, leaving the Washington family to navigate their newfound poverty entirely on their own. I leaned back against my plush chair, picked up my delicate porcelain teacup, and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my chamomile tea. The camera pushes into a tight close-up, framing the absolute unyielding power radiating from my posture. I lowered the teacup and looked directly into the center of the camera lens, breaking the fourth wall with the absolute authority of a reigning queen. My husband said I was an embarrassment. I stated, my voice echoing with a smooth, terrifyingly calm precision. He banned me from his high society masquerade because he thought my presence would stain his impeccable image. But he forgot the most basic, fundamental rule of the elite world he so desperately tried to infiltrate. I offered a final brilliant smile to the lens. The one who holds the money is the one who writes the rules, and the greatest embarrassment of all is biting the hand that feeds you. The scene holds on my triumphant gaze for one powerful, lingering second before the frame flawlessly fades into total, absolute blackness. The most powerful takeaway from this story is the absolute importance of knowing your worth and maintaining your independence. The Washington family built their entire existence on a fragile illusion of status, ultimately destroying themselves by mistreating the very person who silently supported them. True power does not come from conforming to toxic social standards or shrinking yourself to make insecure people comfortable. It comes from authenticity, self-respect, and establishing unbreakable boundaries. When you stop financing the disrespect of those who continuously underestimate you, you reclaim your peace. Never allow anyone to treat you as a liability when you are the asset. If you loved this story of ultimate retribution and reclaiming your power, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and drop a comment below about a time you had to teach someone your true value.